Our scripture reading this morning is from Mark 6, and we'll be reading verses 30 through 44. Hear now the word of the Lord. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat. He said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So with family weekend, this past weekend, my family had the chance to get away for a little mini vacation. We traveled down to Canmore, and while we stayed in Canmore, we were able to go up to Banff and to Lake Louise and to see some of the sights and to do some hiking and to go on some family adventures. For most of our trip, we were around people. There was, we go to Canmore, to Banff, there's always people around on the trails or in the places that you go. And Lake Louise was especially busy. And it wasn't until we were on our way home that we finally found that we had a rest or that we had a bit of a break. Instead of driving up from Canmore towards Calgary and then up this way, we went through the mountains and kind of took the long or the scenic route home. As we traveled, we stumbled across Abraham Lake, and if you've been there, you know that it's quite the sight to see. As we're coming down the hill towards the lake from the southwest side, you hear a voice come from the back of the vehicle saying, Dad, can we stop?" Of course, as soon as I caught a glimpse of the lake, I already had made plans to find a place to pull over and to stop and kind of tour around. We weren't yet sure that it was Abraham Lake, but it looked like a sight to see and a place that we needed to stop. The place that we pulled off the road was aptly named Preacher's Point, so kind of an interesting place to pull over. And so we parked our car and we descended down to the frozen lake and we walked around. We took in the sight of the mountains surrounding the lake. We were able to look down and to see the methane bubbles that come up from the bottom of the lake and they get stuck in the ice. And it's just a fascinating sight to see. If you have a chance, I'd encourage you to go. After about an hour on the lake, we started to get cold. We're like, okay, it's time to move along. We're going to get hungry, we need to eat, find a place to stop. So we made our way back to the vehicle. And as soon as we got in, I immediately imagined myself coming back here again in a few weeks or a few months' time. And then again in the spring, and the summer, and the fall, and next winter. And I just imagined this place being a place of rest. As I was taking pictures with my phone, I looked down and I noticed I had no cell phone reception. And I was blessed by that. I realized quickly that this was a place that you could go and you could have no interruptions, no contact from the outside world, and that you could just simply escape from it all and to get away. Similar to what I imagine Jesus and the disciples looking for as they go across the lake to the place where they went to find rest, this remote place. As we drove from Lake Abraham, I also realized how isolated that place is from civilization. After the lake, we found one gas station, and then 60 kilometers away, we found the hamlet of Nordegg. And if you've been to Nordegg, you know they have 2 gas stations, a coal mining museum, a couple of houses, and not much else. So as I imagined the disciples sending these people away to find somewhere to go to eat, I also pictured them going to a place like Nordegg and looking for something and thinking Nordegg has nowhere near enough food to feed 5,000 people. And so this place, Preacher's Point, is a place that I envisioned Jesus and his disciples crossing the lake and going to find rest. And as they row to the point where they go to find rest, the people make their way around the end of the lake to the shore on the other side. And as the disciples and Jesus come out of the boat, they see the crowd there. And Jesus recognizes them as sheep without a shepherd, and he has compassion on them. And he desires to stay with them, to preach to them, to bring them the gospel, the good news. And I find it interesting, if you focus on some of the detail of the text, that it's not just Jesus that they follow to this point. As I've read this text before, that I've always thought, well, people follow Jesus. He's the one that they're attracted to, they want to be there. But Mark says that they saw them getting into the boat. That they followed them, that they beat them to that place. And it's in fact not just Jesus, but it's also the disciples that these people are following. You see, if you look back to the beginning of Mark 6, you see there that Jesus sends his disciples off on mission 2 by 2. And he tells them as they go to drive out demons, to anoint people, to heal the sick, and to preach the gospel. And so the disciples come back from this trip. They come back from their mission and they return to Jesus in Bethsaida. And they want to share the good news of how they were able to perform these miracles, of how God had worked through them. They had also just heard about John the Baptist being beheaded. And so they were concerned, they were worried about their own lives and about Jesus and about anybody who was trying to share the good news that they had just shared. I'm sure they were also tired. They were exhausted from the trip of traveling about preaching and having people come to them and desire to be healed. And these same people that they had preached to in each of these towns, in each of the villages that they have gone to, seemed to have followed them to where Jesus was. And then they followed him again around the lake to the other side. They desired to hear more, to see more, to experience the gospel message and experience healing from both the hands of the disciples and at the hands of Jesus. And so they come to this desolate or this remote place on the other side of the lake. Jesus sees them, he has compassion on them, and he decides to stay there and to teach them. Now this time of teaching, it goes on for hours. The disciples are watching the sun go from the top of the middle of the sky down towards the west where it's about to set. If they had watches, I'm sure they're looking at their wrists and they're tapping their wrists looking at Jesus, kind of hinting, hey, the time is moving along. They're feeling the hunger in their own bellies. And they're thinking, where am I going to get food? Much less these 5,000 people, 5,000 men plus women and children that are here that Jesus is preaching to. So finally, late in the day, one of the disciples gets the courage. He goes up to Jesus and he interrupts his teaching. And he says, out of concern for the people, why don't we send them away to give them some food? Never mind the hunger in our own bellies. Jesus, how are we going to feed all these people? Send them away so they can find food. Then Jesus turns to that disciple and to the rest who are standing behind, and he says, you give them something to eat. The problem is that they have nothing to give. They have nothing with them. As Jesus sends them out on their mission, he gives them the instruction to go with no food, no bag, and no money in their belts. He says, bring nothing but the sandals on your feet. Don't even pack an extra shirt. And so they go. They go on mission and then they return. And they still have nothing with them. They go with Jesus to this remote and this desolate place. And all they can find when he says, go and find the food that you have, is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Now, if you're picturing the kind of bread that we buy in the store here, the loaf of bread that we break at community time, the bread that they had looks nothing like this. It was no more than an inch thick and about the size of your hand. And 2 or 3 of them might have been enough to feed one person. And the fish they had were likely about this long and that big around. Definitely not enough to feed even the disciples. Much less the 5,000 people there. And Jesus gives them the command, you feed these people. And I wondered as I studied this text and as I prepared this message, how often do we find ourselves in a situation like this? Now, we're likely not being asked to feed 5,000 people. And what we have to offer is likely more than 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. But we are being asked to give. And sometimes it feels like we're being asked to give beyond our means. In church here, you've heard the plea to give toward the church budget. To cover the expenses of keeping this building here, of keeping it lit and keeping it warm when it gets cold outside. You've heard the financial need of various programs and ministries that we run through this church. And in addition to being asked to give towards the budget, you're being asked to give towards fundraisers like the Thanksgiving breakfast, Holy Bullen, the Bottle Drive, and many other things. And then there's this collection bag that goes around. One's for the budget, but the other's for a ministry that's not even part of this church. Today was the Pinocchio Youth Center. Next week it's going to be something else. Ministries that bring the gospel either just down the road or in other countries around the world. And you're being asked to give toward those too. If you're a parent and you have children in Christian school, then you have tuition, you have membership fees, and you have fundraisers through the schools as well. With the threat of Christian schools being defunded by the government, many of us as parents are left wondering, can we really afford to send our kids to Christian school? And this is only 2 areas of our lives, church and school. It seems everywhere we turn, somebody is asking for more of our time and more of our money. And when you add up all these demands on our time, demands on our money, demands on our lives, it's easy to want to turn and to just run from it all, to escape to the mountains and just forget about everything, even if only for a little while. We get exhausted. We feel worn out. We're depleted. And we have nothing left to give. This is what the disciples felt when they looked at these crowds of people. People that they had healed, people from whom they had cast out demons, and people to whom they had ministered and brought the gospel. They had come for rest, and they were exhausted. They were done. And in this moment, Jesus turns to them and he says, you feed them. And to us, he says, go. To us, he says, feed my sheep. And to us, he says, make disciples of all nations. And like the disciples, sometimes all we have is a few coins to throw into the collection basket. A few minutes a week to help with this one thing or that other thing. What we have is not much more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. But really, is that all we have? We need to look at the story a little closer and look to what the disciples actually have, because they have much less and much more than what we think in this story. You see, as we mentioned, they just returned from their first mission trip. Jesus sent them out without food, without provision, and yet they had all they needed. They were able to eat. They were able to sleep as they traveled about. They were able to preach the gospel without having to beg for food or for a place to stay or for clothes on their back or anything else. And not only did they have their needs provided for, but they were able to bring healing. They were able to cast out demons. They were able to preach to others in the time that they were out. And they returned to Jesus. And they want to share with Jesus all that, as Mark says, all they had done. And I wonder, I find that word interesting, all they had done. And I wonder too, the text isn't clear on this, so don't quote me, but I wonder if Jesus brought them away, not just to find rest, but to teach them another lesson. What they had experienced, the things that they were part of, were amazing. They were blessed to be part of Jesus' ministry in casting out demons and healing. But it's almost as if they were forgetting that who gave them the power to do this? Who was working through them as they cast these demons out and as they were bringing healing to these people? It's as if Jesus is saying to his disciples, oh, you think you did all that when you were on mission? You think that was your work? Okay, well then you can come and feed these 5,000 people. The disciples immediately know when Jesus gives this command that feeding 5,000 people is impossible. They knew that they couldn't. It would take half a year's wages, even if they could find the bread to feed this many people. And if you think about the disciples and what they did, they made it their job to follow Jesus around. Therefore, half a year's wages is not even something they had because they were his disciples. They had left their nets, they left their fishing boats, and they had left the tax collecting booth to follow Jesus, so they didn't even have an income. And now Jesus was asking them to feed this many people with the pittance, the nothingness that they had. Well, no, that's not exactly what's happening. What Jesus is doing in this text is he's asking them to trust him. He was asking them to look to him to provide, not only for all their needs, but also for the needs of the people who were there. The needs of the men, the women, and the children who had followed them around the lake. It was an impossible task that he was giving them to feed 5,000 people. But he had also given them an impossible task of casting out demons and of healing people of their illnesses. And they seem to have forgotten that it was through him that they were able to do any of what they have done already. And then it was through him that they even had the food to fill their bellies and the clothes on their backs and a place to stay at night. And as soon as they admit that there is nothing they can do, Jesus immediately puts them to work. He sends them to bring what food they do have. And so the disciples go and they find these 5 loaves and these 2 fish. And they give them to Jesus. He takes them from him. He holds them in his hands. He looks up to heaven. He blesses God and he gives thanks for the provision that God has given. And then Jesus puts the food back into the hands of the disciples. Now Mark doesn't explain exactly how this miracle happens. But it's not as if when Jesus holds the bread and he gives thanks that suddenly he's holding enough bread to feed this many people. No, he's still holding 5 loaves and 2 fish. And what he puts back into the hands of the disciples, the way I understand it, sounds like it's that same 5 loaves and 2 fish. And it's in their hands that the miracle occurs. It's in the hands of the disciples that the food goes from this 5 loaves and 2 fish to enough to feed 5,000 men plus women and children. And it's interesting because the people there don't even seem to notice the miracle. It's simply like the disciples are holding the bread and the fish in their hands or in their basket, and they pass it out, and they pass it out, and it just never runs out until everyone has food. It's somewhat like Elijah and the widow when he goes to stay with her for the 3 years in the famine, and she only has a little bit of oil and a little bit of flour, and she's prepared to make 1 loaf of bread, one last meal. And through a miracle, that flour and that oil last over 3 years. They last long enough to survive the famine for both Elijah, the widow, and her son. And that's how I kind of imagine this bread being expanded enough so that everyone has enough to eat. That they just keep taking and they keep passing out, and there's always enough until every last person has had something. So Jesus tells the disciples to feed the people there. And in the end, they do feed the people there, but they needed his help to do it. They needed him to provide the miracles in order to be able to feed that many people. Jesus took the little that they gave, the little that they brought to him, and he turned it into an abundance. He turned it into enough to feed a multitude. And this is the same with us. We are called to give. We are called to support the ministries of this church and other ministries that seek to bring forth the gospel, to reach the lost, the hurt, the lonely, and the broken. And we are called to give of our time to benefit others both in this church and in our community around us. We are called to give what little we have, trusting that God will not only provide for all of our needs, but that he will turn what little we are able to give into an abundance, into what's more than enough for all the needs that we're seeking to fill. In Mark 12, we read about Jesus sitting in the temple and watching people come and put their money in the temple treasury. And a number of rich people come, and out of the great wealth that they have, they throw in a great amount of money. And then one poor old woman comes, and she throws in 2 copper coins, which is a mere pittance compared to what these rich have given. But Jesus sees this, and he turns to his disciples, and he says, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the temple treasury than all the others." You see, the point is not about the dollar figure. It's not about how much we give. It's not about how much time we give to others either. The point that Jesus makes is that our giving is a sign of our ability to trust him. When you give more than you think that you can, you soon find out that you really didn't need that much. You didn't need as much as you thought. When you give more than you have to give, you soon realize that you have much more than you thought you had already. Being rich isn't about a dollar figure. It's about trusting God to provide for all your needs and for trusting him to use you to be a blessing to other people. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to go on a mission trip to the Dominican Republic. And while we were staying there, while this group that we were with were staying in the Dominican, we had the chance to attend a small church in Batay, which is a small community of sugarcane workers that all live on the farm. So it's a community on the corner of the farm where they work. And we worshiped there with them on a Sunday. And very much like our church services, they have the collection bag or the plate that goes around, and people put in what they can. But what they do different is the deacons will come up behind where the pastor stands, and they will count out the money before anyone leaves the building as the service is going on. And if there's not enough in the collection plate, they'll go out and they'll collect more. And as we were sitting there, they didn't go past us as a group of Canadians who were there to build buildings and to offer our services. But they went to everybody else who was part of that church the second time looking for more money. And it's not that they couldn't have used the money that we could put in because we had much more to offer than what they had. And they could have used it. But they were sending a different message with this offering, and this message was one of trust. This message was one that they're saying God has given all that we need, and He is calling us to give more than we think we can. And we could rely on that group of Canadians sitting over there, but we're not. We're going to trust God because He has blessed us. For them, the offering was a sign of showing their trust, of showing God's faithfulness to them. So this morning, I don't want you to think that this message is simply about the pastor saying, well, we need to give more money each week. That's a very small part of this sermon. It's in fact almost nothing to do with what I want to say. What I want you to hear this morning is that we are called to put our faith, to put our trust in God. And as we do that with our time, we do that with our checkbook, and we do that in so many other ways. But what we need to hear this morning is that God has already provided for all our needs. And He is asking us to put our trust in Him by giving of what He has given to us. As we heard a few weeks ago when we had Cadet Sunday here, their theme was, you are blessed to be a blessing. And people of God, we too are blessed. We are called to be a blessing. And to give of all the resources that we have so that we can put our trust in Him. Amen. Let us pray. Dear Father in heaven, we give thanks for the so many ways that you have provided for our needs, Lord. And so too we give thanks for the call to put our faithfulness, put our trust in you, God, because you are a faithful God. And that's hard at times. It's hard to imagine where the things that we need are coming from when we're giving away so much, Lord, but you call us to give and you call us to trust. And so we pray that we may trust you not only with our checkbooks, not only with our time, but with our whole lives, that we may give ourselves to you, and that we may live our lives in full service to you so that other people may know, and so that we may know that you are a God who provides for all.